do it. Now we're recording. So yes, I'm Dr. Matt, and this is Giftedness in the Wild. We're going to be talking about giftedness and neurodiversity from a DEI perspective and how that impacts all of us. So let's go ahead and get started. Right. All right. So you guys are welcome to use the chat for this piece. What words come to mind when you hear the word gifted? So feel free to throw that in the chat. Smart, definitely, for sure. Special, unique, exceptional. You guys have good words here. These are very good, they're very good words. Innate, like that. High IQ, for sure. All these, but also struggles of time. Yes, Amelia, you're right. Other words you might hear are intense, quirky, different, definitely, special, higher ability. This is a sharp group. I like this. And if we kept going, sooner or later, you would hear words like this: Einstein, Edison, Newton, the giants of Western thought, right? And certainly Newton and Einstein and Edison were all incredibly intelligent people who accomplished a lot and literally changed the world. But there's a problem with this slide, and I know it because I made it, is that we have three old dead white guys, right? And there's a lot of conception, even today, that giftedness is this sort of, academic, that we associate with rich white kids, especially rich white boys from the suburbs. And that's why I want to broaden that conversation to, having everybody have a seat at the table. So, we've got Nicki Minaj, Michael Jordan, and Bobby Flay on the slide here. And I like to think that I'm the first person in history to put all three of these illustrious people on a slide together. And while none of them are, academically revered like Newton and Einstein and Tesla and all those, you can't sit here and say that they're not brilliant, they're not gifted at what they do. So we want to, really have a broader sense of what giftedness is and also the different areas in which it manifests. And specifically for our conversation today, thinking about somebody like Bobby Flay, who is very gifted, but also has ADHD and dyslexia. So he's a very twice exceptional person. He said even to this day, he's got to have people around him who read his contracts for like the 97 shows he has on the Food Network because he still struggles with that. So, we're seeing, different faces and forms of giftedness and broader neurodiversity. So the gifted and talented definition that I like to use is from my colleague and dear friend, Susan Johnson. And her definition, this is the one we use at the federal level. The term gifted and talented, when used in respect to students, children, or youth, means these kids have evidence of high performance capability in our creative, leadership, artistic, or in specific academic fields. So I think that's what, if you ask most people would more or less say, like, yeah, that makes sense as a definition for what we're talking about today. But then because we love Sue, she goes on to add this vital piece. She says, and who requires services or activities not ordinarily provided by the school in order to develop their capabilities. That's the key piece of this definition, is that when we think about giftedness, we think about it as outside of the normal bounds of what school does and what community services do. It's an additional thing. And we're going to unpack that a little bit more as we go. So, what are the strengths of being gifted? These kids have an incredible capacity to learn. They care a great deal about the subject or subjects they're interested in. They think outside the box. They're really creative. They're capable of high levels of achievement and performance. So this is sort of what we got into when we were doing our chat exercise before. Gifted kids have a strong sense of justice. Sometimes that works against them, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Gifted kids are also very precocious. And yep. And this cartoon here, where the teacher's saying to the student, "How many times do I have to tell you you're not supposed to read ahead?" That, not only is a very funny cartoon, it describes a lot of the kids that I serve, but it's actually very indicative of my own experience being identified as gifted. So I'm gifted in ADHD. And when I was in second grade, they gave us a math workbook on Friday, and they told us to do pages 1 through 4. So I went home and I did pages 1 through 4, and they weren't that hard. So I did pages 5, 6, 7, 8, finish the book. It's very much like Forrest Gump, right? Like, I got to the end of my driveway and I just kept running because I just kept doing the math because the math wasn't that hard. And I brought it back to school on Monday and I showed it to my teacher, Miss Vaughn, and she sent me to the principal's office because they were very convinced that I had cheated, right? That I had looked up the answers or, had my parents fill it out for me. And they kept saying, "We didn't teach you this math at the back of the book." And I kept saying, "It's not that hard." So they brought my parents in and they explained to them that they were pretty sure that I was gifted. We did an IQ test. Surprise, surprise, I was. But that was a very precocious sort of thing. Like, not only getting the math workbook done, but like saying to the adults in charge, like, "It isn't that hard," is a very precocious thing to do. Now I have my own kids who are very precocious, and I'm like, it's all come back around. What's challenging about being gifted? And these are where a lot of people, their conversations sort of tend to stop at the strengths of it. But the challenges about being gifted include emotional sensitivity, emotional intensity. The gifted kids develop asynchronously. They have high levels of perfectionism. They tend to struggle with their peers and social skills. There's a lot of pressure on gifted kids. Some of that is internal, stuff they give to themselves, and some of it is external. In one study from Johns Hopkins University, they found that gifted kids hear the word Harvard 10,000 times by the time they start high school. So whether we mean to or not, we are creating a dialogue around these kids that says you have to go to the best school on planet Earth. The implication being is that if you don't do that, what's wrong with you, right? And I've got nothing against Harvard. It's an amazing school, but it's not the right fit for everybody, let alone every gifted kid. And mainstream education, mainstream providers are not trained in this. When I lived in Pennsylvania, I was on the board for the Pennsylvania Gifted Association, and we would go around to various colleges who had strong education majors, and I would offer to give a free class on giftedness, and they would take me up on it. Almost all of them saying, like, "We don't do this. We don't have that class. We don't have even that lecture." So by attending this 1 hour lunch and learn, you're going to learn a lot more than many of your colleagues. And I hope that you take this information and run with it. Let's talk about asynchronous development. So the giftedness is a piece of neurodivergence, or people who have different brains. The more neurodivergent you are, the more you tend to develop asynchronously or out of sync. The world is built for neurotypical people. Neurotypical people tend to develop synchronously or in sync. So if you look at our circle here on the left, you're seeing that this ring of chronological age, let's call this kid 10 years old, academic, math, motor, verbal, social, special talent, emotionally, all more or less hang together, right? If you're 10 in academics and social and emotional, you're probably 10 in all those things. But over here, On our asynchronous development, what you have is a very out of sync profile. So if that kid is also 10 years old, you'll see the special talent is probably 12, 13. Emotional is more like 8 or 9. Academic verbals, 14, maybe 15. Social, age appropriate. Motor, a little bit below age appropriate. And academic math, probably, 13, 14, something in there. So you see and what that does is the more the system is out of phase, the more stress is on the system. And the more stress we're under, the more anxious we become. I worked with a young man early in my career. He was 8 years old and taking graduate math courses at the University of Pennsylvania, one of the finest academic schools in the world. And he was not only taking these classes, he was acing them. And then when he was at home, he was having meltdowns because he could not figure out how to tie his shoes. And he would say to me, Dr. Matt, how is it that I can do this kind of math, but I can't tie my shoes? And I showed him the slide. I was like, this is asynchronous development, bud. Like your academics are so far out of whack. I'm sorry, out of phase that energy had to come from somewhere. And for you, it was a fine motor skill thing. This is another way to look at asynchrony. And you see the spread under here, right? So the more neurodivergent somebody is, once you get into twice exceptionality or multiple exceptionalities, this spread on the bottom level will be further and further apart. So where do all these differences come from? And it comes from the brain. And this understanding represents a sea change from certainly how it was when I was a kid, right? It was, you are smart, and that's the end of the conversation. What we know now is that the gifted brain is a different brain. That's why it has a seat at the table when it comes to neurodiversity. So the gifted brain is different in morphology. The size, shape, and quantity of structures is different. Operations, how things are used in the brain are different. Location, how and why the brain is used, or what we call lateralization, is different in the gifted brain. And electroneurochemical functions, there are significant differences in electrical and chemical activity in the gifted brain. And this is just sort of a silly way to test this. If anybody in this group identifies as gifted and or neurodivergent, give me a thumbs up if you struggle with sleeping. So if you're a neurodivergent person and you struggle with sleeping, throw me a thumbs up emoji, or pop that in the chat, whatever works for you. Seeing lots of thumbs ups appear. And I always do this as a little acid test because one of the neurotransmitters that is used differently in the gifted brain is serotonin. Serotonin impacts mood and appetite and sex drive and emotional regulation and also sleep. Things that gifted people tend to struggle with is appetite and sleep and mood regulation. So, the gifted brain's inefficient use of serotonin is in this case a marker of how it fits in with broader neurodiversity. And the question here from let's see, is that always the case? Are there examples of gifted academically without lower errors and other lows and other errors? Great question. Yes, one of the things we know is that synchrony happens to everybody. Some kids are more or less whole together. Like, so we have a kid who's 10 who's maybe 9 socially, emotionally, and intellectually 13, 14, but it's more or less together. But one of the things we know is that asynchrony shows up differently for everybody. And if you're somebody who, say, has a lot of social skills, that can cover for some challenges in some other areas. We may not often know our asynchrony until later in life. I like to use myself as an example. I was totally socially fine and typical up until middle school when everybody hit puberty. And all of a sudden, I felt like everybody got like a playbook or a handbook that I never got because they were going to boy-girl parties and they were going on dates. And I was just so not ready for any of that. And it was like, they were all of a sudden everybody was speaking Latin, where they had always been speaking English. And you
لحظة
know,
لحظة لحظة إيش
and it was such a shift, right? So, asynchrony can show up in many different ways, though it does show up differently for different people. Great question. So, giftedness is a distinct neurological profile. It's a more efficient brain. There's more connections, so information moves around more quickly. There are poor self-regulation and executive functioning skills. If you take your finger and point to the front of your head, right here, that's your prefrontal cortex, the front part of your brain. That's where our executive functioning skills are. And that part of the brain comes online a lot later in gifted individuals. So in neurotypical kids, the prefrontal cortex fully develops somewhere between 20 and 24. For those of us who went to college, it may explain a lot of what we did in college. No comment on that one. But neurodivergent kids, we see the prefrontal cortex fully developed somewhere around age 30. So we're talking about a decade lag between the gifted brain and a neurotypical brain. And that's just one example. We know that the gifted brain has a larger amygdala. The amygdala is the source of fight or flight emotions in our brain. And when that thing is larger, you just have more capacity for more of this emotionality. They're very reactive in social situations. The basal ganglia is the reward circuit of our brain. We know that's directly linked with perfectionism and OCD. So gifted individuals who have a larger basal ganglia are thus more likely to have perfectionistic tendencies. Creativity, the supramarginal gyrus, one of my favorite parts of the brain, and overexcitabilities. It's also worth noting that whereas many pieces of the brain we can point to, like the amygdala does fight or flight emotions, there it is, we see it. When it comes to intelligence, our brain works a little bit differently. It's this area right here. So if you chase where your hairline is, this is the parietal frontal integration area. That's where intelligence comes from. It's the intersection of these two areas. And this does memory, attention, cognition, creativity, are all part of this part of the brain. And we know this part of the brain develops a lot sooner in gifted individuals.
But I think it's getting stuck as well.
And I think a big piece of that, right, is there we go. I think a big piece of this that's worth paying attention to is that because so much energy goes to that part of the brain early in development, other things lag behind, right? I think that the overdevelopment of the PFIT gives us some of the neurological understandings for the asynchronous development, because that energy's got to come from somewhere. There's only so much energy to go around. And one of the other things that's really interesting is that this part of the brain also handles personality. So if you have a gifted kid or you're gifted yourself, and you were running around the playground like a little senator or a little game show host, it kind of tells you that this part of the brain was online a lot faster, and their personality comes directly from that. So here's our friend, the prefrontal cortex. Let's see. So like I said, prefrontal cortex is in the frontal lobe. It's our executive functioning skills, planning, follow through, task initiation, behavioral inhibition. Now, behavioral inhibition is probably it's probably the thing we notice the most. Because, if I'm sitting there and I ask a kid in class, okay, what's the capital of Pennsylvania? For many gifted kids, by the time I'm done saying the word Pennsylvania, they're already shouting out that the answer is Harrisburg, right? Harrisburg. And it's because they can't inhibit that behavior. Inhibiting the behavior is reading the room and stopping before you do it. Instead of ready, fire, aim, it's ready, aim, fire. I often say that the gifted brain is like, well, it's like this. It's like a traffic it's like the Beltway on a Friday afternoon, right? I mean, the cars are just backed up from here to the Capitol building. And when things get backed up, that's when accidents happen, right? Things get, complicated, things get backed up and we make mistakes. So you've got all this information whipping through the gifted brain, going to this prefrontal cortex piece, whose job it is to sort it all out, put the right things in the right places, inhibit the right behaviors, and it gets bottlenecked and it gets bogged down, right? If you think about the gifted brain like a car, the gifted brain itself is like a 2024 Ferrari Testarossa. I mean, unbelievable horsepower, boom, 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 boom. But the prefrontal cortex in the gifted brain is kind of like the brake system on a 1988 Dodge Dart. It's just not a great mix. It's not a great fit. So here is a nice little chart that shows you how all these different kinds of neurodivergence sort of factor into each other, right? We've got dyslexia, ADHD, autism, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, all of these things sort of can overlap with each other, which is why when we see a kid with one neurodivergence, whether it's ADHD, autism, giftedness, dyslexia, it makes sense to test for other ones because we know that one indicates others, because a lot of these pieces of the brain are all indicated coming from the same pieces of the brain. Then we get into our friend overexcitabilities. Now, this is based on the work of the Polish psychologist Kazimierz Dabrowski, and it's areas of the brain that are overly wired neurologically. So we've got the gifted brain, which has more connections than the neurotypical brain, and then you've got the overexcitabilities, which are even more, even deeper areas of wiredness, right? So instead of having like a satellite dish on the roof of your house, you have one of those giant satellite dishes that they have in Arizona that they're looking for aliens with. It's that kind of thing. Overexcitabilities are heightened abilities to both receive and respond to stimuli, and that shows up as increased sensitivity, awareness, and intensity. And there are 5 areas of overexcitability: psychomotor, emotional, imaginational, intellectual, and sensory. So your psychomotor OE is love of movement for the sake of movement. Around and 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 around we go. And they may not understand why other people don't have their energy, enthusiasm, motivation. And oftentimes these kids come across as obnoxious. Like they're a handful to have in class because they just have so much energy. And they're often misdiagnosed with ADHD. To meet the needs of these kids, we want to build in micro breaks during the day, let them move around. I never have kids walking around during my classes or my therapy sessions. Sometimes you just gotta get that energy out. Having fidgets, having something to do with their hands goes a long way for helping kids with way too much energy survive. And there's a lot of expectation setting and being creative at home and in school. Can you get your kid a bouncy chair? Can you have a bag of fidgets for the car or the classroom? Those kind of creative solutions can go a long way to helping that overexcitability. Next, we have the emotional overexcitability. My colleague Josh Shane is fond of saying a gifted kid will get their feelings catastrophically hurt in situations where most people wouldn't even have feelings. I think that's a pretty good indication of this population. Gifted kids have heightened, intense feelings for themselves and others. So gifted kids will often show up very aggressively when they feel like the rights of other people have been violated, right? So I don't like you bullying this other kid, and I'm going to insert myself into it because I had such a big response to that. There's just that gifted kid's sense of justice. So to help these kids, we accept and acknowledge their emotions. We don't argue with feelings. Feelings are feelings. We teach them self-regulation techniques. We really want them to be in charge of the emotional experience they have. As I often say to my kids, it is your right as a person to feel whatever you feel about whatever you feel. Nobody can take that away from you. But it's what you do with those feelings that matter. So if your feelings are hurt, you have a right to have your feelings hurt. You don't have a right to punch somebody in the face, right? That's where we draw the line. Right? Imagination, more active and engaged imagination. So they use a lot of imagery, metaphor, and what we call a facility for invention, which is fancy psychology work for lying. Gifted kids are often very common liars. And if you think about kids mixing truth with fiction, oftentimes that's a way to embellish what happened. You know, gifted kids use their imagination to escape boredom, but the problem is that comes at a cost, right? If you're not paying attention in class, you're going to miss when the homework is, or you're going to miss that there's an assembly, you're going to miss vital information. So we need to teach kids when to imagine and then pair those skills with mindfulness skills so we can return to the world and put our feet flat on the ground when we need to. Because being present isn't that bad. We just need to have the skills to return when we need to. Intellectual OE, little clip here from Sherlock Holmes. Gifted kids have a marked need to seek knowledge and understand information. These kids have incredibly active minds. They seek and create challenges for themselves. It is often that gifted kids won't just write the paper, they'll want to write the paper in Klingon, right? Or they won't just do the PowerPoint, they'll also build a scale model of ancient Rome out of Legos. Right? They need those challenges, but then we get into the problems with the prefrontal cortex, and then the kids don't follow through, which frustrates the parents and the teachers and the coaches and the therapists. So, gifted kids will be very impatient with those who don't match their level of interest or thought in their topic. So like a kid might wear a Star Wars shirt to school, and if your gifted kid loves Star Wars, they'll immediately dive into like deep lore and like, what do you think the cloaks of armor mean in Mandalorian season 2? And the kid who they're talking to is like, I like Luke Skywalker. Is that a thing? Right? There's just a mismatch. So to do this, we teach kids how to learn, right? We teach learning not as a passive process, but as an active process and getting them involved in it. We can teach them the skills through independent studies. Gifted kids love independent studies. So it's a way to have that genius hour, to build a project that has meaning to them and connect them with people from the community, online resources. That's a way that's really going to fire them up and keep them engaged. And also practicing group work. Gifted kids tend to really struggle with it. So how do we have repeated open exposure to group work in a way that feels supportive and skill building rather than like, what do you mean you can't do this? Because that's when we start to lose our kids. And last but not least, the sensory overexcitabilities. So the parietal lobe, which is the top part of our brain, is the sensory integration area of our brain. Gifted people often have a heightened experience of sensory pleasure or displeasure from sensory input like smell, taste, touch, etc. And that is easily overwhelming or distractible. So kids will deal with that by either dramatically seeking out being the center of attention, or seeking out their sensory input, which we call sensory seekers, or they will run away from those things, which we call sensory avoiders. And to work with these kids, we need to think about what are the areas that are overstimulating. My son hates loud noises, so we're not going to go to the minor league baseball game where it has fireworks after the show, because that's just a noise that hurts his ears. And also, what sensory inputs give pleasure? Think about your favorite hoodie, right? What do you like about your favorite hoodie? Is it soft? Is it oversized? Do you have a hood that you can pull over and you're getting some stimulation that way? We tend to only think about sensory stuff as a negative, but sensory stuff can have a lot of positivity too. I often tell parents to start with clothes and food. What foods give pleasure? What foods are not helpful for us? We have a lot of kids who are picky eaters out there. And being a picky eater is a kind of sensory stimulation, right? We want to make space for that. And also clothes. I can't tell you how many teen girls I've worked with who started to show behavior challenges in middle school, high school, because they started wearing bras or different kinds of underwear that were really uncomfortable for them. But if you don't have the language to talk about that stuff, you're just sitting there in a lot of discomfort all day until you have a meltdown. So talking about clothes, talking about like, there are so many companies now that sell sensory friendly clothing, right? Tags, loose, having some flexibility in the fabric goes a long way. And then, yes, watching out for bathrooms. Bathrooms are a sensory nightmare. They are loud and they are smelly and they're always too bright and they're always like weirdly wet for some reason. Why are they always wet? I don't like it. Um, you've got the loud sounds from the hair dryers, you've got the harsh lighting, you've got the general physical uncomfortableness of sharing that kind of space. So what we do is we lean into that, right? We say like, how can I give you a bathroom experience that is more manageable? And when I take my neurodivergent kids out in public, usually I start with where are the bathrooms, where are the family rooms that we can use that are going to give our kids a more pleasant sensory experience. So do gifted kids struggle? Well, you wouldn't be here if they didn't. I'll let Gary Larson show us the Midvale School for the Gifted, but this is my Monday through Friday 9 to 5. This is what I do. So we talked about neurotypical versus neurodivergent. This section here, this 68% of kids in the middle, those are neurotypical kids with typical brains and typical behaviors. The world is built for them. And honestly, it makes sense, right? I mean, if you're going to build systems like education and sports and, and office buildings, you're going to build them for the most people. But the most classroom instructions here, the world is built for these kids. But then our kids start here at 1:30 and they're out in this red area heading out on infinitum. So while there are less of neurodivergent people, it doesn't mean that we don't deserve to have our needs met, right? So the world may not be friendly to being neurodivergent. It may actually be antagonistic to being neurodivergent, but we can find environments that honor and support the uniqueness of our brains. So there's somewhere between 3 and 5 million kids, gifted kids in this country, somewhere around 10% of the student population. So we look, that's a general idea. It's really hard to get a complete total of that because it's up to every individual state to identify gifted kids in their ways, right? So whereas like Virginia and Maryland do a really great job, West Virginia doesn't do a great job, and every state has a different way of reporting that. So it's a challenge to really get a sense of like where we're at there. And it's even more challenging to get a sense of twice exceptional students, right? Because we know about 1 out of 6 gifted kids are going to struggle either behaviorally or academically, and we want to support them. Now, when it comes to twice exceptional students, the most recent data are somewhere around 300,000. I think that is a wild underestimate. I would add at least 1 0 to that and probably double it. Because what we know is that when you have a gifted brain and a learning difference, so that could be ADHD, autism, dysgraphia, dyslexia, it makes engaging in school harder. It makes learning harder. It makes kids more likely to not go to school, more likely to not engage with the classroom, all these things that can keep them from being identified. So that's why I tell parents, one, neurodivergence tends to indicate others. So if you have a kid who's dyslexic, you should ask for an IQ test because you might find that even though your kid struggles with reading, when it comes to nonverbal intelligence, things like problem solving, pattern recognition, your kiddo is crushing it, right? So we really want to make sure we're always getting a sense of how the kid's brain works so we can meet them in all the best areas to give interventions. Okay, so I've been talking about, I'm gonna have you guys do a little exercise for me. So these are what gifted kids look like in the classroom, right? Because there's still this perception that gifted kids look like this, right? Hands folded, eyes straight ahead. Yes, teacher, whatever teacher, I'll answer the question like, yeah, good, 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 good. Gifted kids can look like that in the classroom, but they often look in these other ways. So use the chat for this first one. Gifted kids might get along better with adults than their peers, and they seem standoffish. What are they going to send? What are they going to send that kid to my office with, right? I'm the mental health professional. what are they going to pass along to me? They're going to say, we think this kid is what? Not socializing properly. Yep, not social. You know, this is where we often get a referral for this is often when we get anxious, possible, you know, oh, you got it. That was my idea there. You know, often that's an autism or what we used to call Asperger's referral. What about this next kid? Definitely can't handle the normal classroom chaos. This next kid might look zoned out, forgetful, scattered. What's the referral we're getting for that? ADHD. Zoe, you're right though. These kids are definitely much more likely to get bullied. Stoned. Why I never, Kevin. My goodness. Yes, that is also very much a thing. Next one might spend hours and hours on homework, making sure it is perfect. What diagnosis are we getting there? Probably not certain for this one, Kevin. Anxious, OCD, yep, perfectionistic. Those are the ones we see a lot, because these kids will, these kids will grind themselves into dust. I work with a 10-year-old girl in New Jersey who just had her third ulcer. And I mean, like a 10-year-old girl should not have had any ulcers, let alone 3. But she's so stressed out all the time about making sure all her schoolwork is perfect that she's literally burning a hole in her stomach. Next one is might know more than the teacher and not be shy about letting them know. Very, very common. Mm-hmm. Krista, I feel like you may be of this community because that is a very accurate assessment of the ADHD homework process. Obnoxious, definitely. And obnoxious, disrespectful. And one of the things I tell teachers all the time is that regular education teachers tend not to like gifted students because they challenge the norm. They ask hard questions. They don't go along to get along. Gifted kids in regular classroom can make things actually harder for you, not easier. And then last but not least, might be so underwhelmed by school that they stop trying. And this is a very common referral for me, right? Slacker, yep, that's a big one. Lazy, not trying, oh yes, the old song, not living up to their potential. Golly gee, what does that even mean, right? It makes me wonder. Another one here is depressed, right? I can't tell you how often I get a referral for somebody that this kid was getting straight A's and doing great, and now they're not. What's wrong with the kid? And, if you've looked outside or read the news anytime in the last 4 years, there's a lot of things to be stressed out and anxious about and worried about. And those are all real things. On the flip side of that, there are also lots of reasons where a kid might disengage in school that are more organic. One of them might be depression. Another one might be, this is too easy for me and I don't care. Right? You're asking me to read Tom Sawyer when I want to read Dostoevsky, right? So how do we help? The first thing is we have the conversation that gifted education is special education, right? So if you think about it, core curriculum is tier 1. We tend to think about special education as the below standards model, right? Kids need strategic instruction and intensive intervention. Gifted kids are on the other side of that IQ spectrum. They need strategic instruction and, in some cases, intensive intervention. If you've got a 9-year-old who can do calculus, that's an intensive intervention, right? That is a huge shift in how we're managing those kids and that kid's education. So gifted education is special education. But yes, and Krista, you're right. It isn't thought of that way, which is why I am telling you guys this, and which is why I'm going to send you these slides so you can share them with your districts and say, we listened to this guy at lunch and he seemed to know what he was talking about. It impacts all of us because there are gifted and twice exceptional kids in every classroom, and they may not know it. They may not be aware of their giftedness. They may think they're broken. How could I be smart if I'm dysgraphic? Well, let's figure that out. We want to support our best and brightest. From a teaching perspective, this pushes the boundaries of pedagogy and practice. Like, these are the kids that actually we got into education and mental health for, because they challenge us. They make us think outside the box. There's a lot of integration with social emotional needs. That's why oftentimes people collaborate with somebody like me. And it's high level collaboration across the educational team. IEPs, gifted plans, 504s, it's all baked into that system. The 504 plan. Yes, I write many of them, and that mine are designed not to be terrible, but a lot of them are. How to reach these kids, we need to achieve. I love an acronym. Oh, hey, look at that. We need to be authentic. Gifted kids crave authenticity. If you're not going to show up as authentic, they'll smell it a mile away. Creative, thinking outside the box, coming up with different strategies for education and assessment. Be humble. If you don't know the answer, tell them. I don't actually know as much about coding as you do. Could you tell me more about Scratch? Always lead with kids' interests. It always amazes me when teachers will say stuff like, well, all he wants to do is talk about Minecraft. How am I supposed to teach him ancient Egypt if all he wants to talk about is Minecraft? It's like, you're telling me you couldn't tell this kid to build a pyramid in Minecraft, right? Like, when a kid shows you their interest, it's a way to open the door to education for them to build that relationship. Be explicit. Gifted kids tend to struggle with subtext. So if you mean a thing, say the thing. Oftentimes adults will only say part of the thing they mean, and they won't put the other piece in there until it's too late. Be very communicative. Talk with the kid, talk with the parent, talk with the mental health professional, make sure that we're all staying online, and be empathetic. Being smart isn't easy, and it's easy to think so. But if you walk in the classroom expecting a kid to be superhuman and they have a bad day or they have an area they struggle with, and if we don't meet that with empathy, that kid's going to really struggle. So here are some solid teaching techniques. I often say to educators, the best practices in gifted education are just the best practices in education, full stop. So we want to compact the curriculum. If a kid shows you they can do something, let them move on to the next thing. Like if you give a kid a worksheet of 50 math problems and the kid gets the first 10 correct, argument is that they're probably not going to get the next 40 wrong. So we can move on, we can move through things more quickly. Differentiation, teaching the same content in a different way or a deeper way, using project-based learning, building projects or that are tying into what these kids need. It's really like facilitates like a lot of like hands-on learning. Independent studies, which you already covered. Acceleration, where's the next place this kid can go to get the things they need? I love acceleration. Sometimes it can be just, you're in 4th grade math, now walk across the hall to 5th grade math. Sometimes it's you take the bus over to the high school and you do music there. Sometimes it's you take a creative writing class at the community college, right? We need to think outside the box to give the kids the levels and layers of engagement that they need. And then integrating social emotional learning because of the differences in the brain that we struggle with. So Ms. Cartoon says, Ms. Thomas, you'll have to come pick up your son. He's swinging from a chandelier, claiming he can and will divide by 0. These are very much the kids I have. So what to look for, things academically for these kids. They race through the work, often making silly mistakes. Not writing your name on a paper, not following through with a negative sign, that sort of thing. Gifted kids constantly lose things. I think this is where the idea of the absent-minded professor comes from. Where's my jacket? Where's my lunchbox? Where's my wallet? Where's my phone? Where's my keys? really interested in a specific topic, series, or class. This is a fun phenomenon. We call this the gifted C. You get a kid who gets zeros on all the class participation stuff because they're not paying attention, and homework because they forget about the homework. So the teacher assumes this kid is not going to get an A in my class, but then the kid crushes all the assessments. They class all the chapter tests and all the papers because they can do this stuff. They just are not showing up at it, and it ends up averaging out to be a C. When I talk to schools, I'm like, is there a kid here who pisses you off? Like a kid that you're like, oh, if they could only get it together. And the teacher raised their hand. I was like, those are the kids I want to talk to. Um, um, Seems bored or checked out in certain classes. This is usually where we get into like the humanities versus STEM class split. The STEM teachers are like, this kid's amazing. I love this kid. And the humanities teachers are like, he's the worst. Will interrupt you or correct you. It's a big one. Sneaks books or drawings or tries to play Rubik's Cube in class. Oftentimes we see a phenomenon that we call inverse school. So gifted kids are super excited for math, science, reading, history, and less excited for art, music, gym, recess, because they like classes with structure and academic content, and they tend to struggle more in the specials because they're less structured, they're less rigorous, requires more social skills, that sort of thing. Social emotional, if you were ever described as an old soul, might be a thing. Kids who want to hang out more with adults than their peers, kids who are really intense, interpersonally, academically, emotionally. The way they speak at you is like that rapid fire hose. Kids who feel like they just don't fit together. That's that asynchrony piece we talked about. Quirky, odd, iconoclastic in their wardrobe or their interests. One of my colleagues out in Oregon calls gifted kids capes. Because she's like, they're kind of like superheroes, right? Like when they're at school, it's like their secret identity because they're masking. But when they're at home, they can put on their superhero costume. And she always pauses and then she goes, but they also, a lot of them wear capes to school. So they're easy to see. Doesn't dialogue monologues. Got a lot of monologuers out there. Has a tough time letting things go, takes things personally, more likely to be introverted, poor reading the room. You can find gifted kids in any school, any class. Yes, Jennifer, rushing through classwork because they want to read a book that's 4 grade levels ahead. That is these kids in a nutshell. They'll be in the library media center, playing creative or made up games, talking to adults, reading the same book or books over and over and over, and where they just feel best, where they feel safe. Since we have outside the box thinkers, great way to reach these kids are riddles, brain teasers, puzzles, mazes. So just to sort of give you guys a taste, we've got this question here. How is 220 minus 140, 40? So if you think you know the answer, put it in the chat. It is correct as written. How is 220 minus 140, 40? Different base, not base 10. Very good. Marianne, do you know what base it is? I'll give you guys a hint. Puck, pick, puck. So technically speaking, this is a base 6 system, though certainly base 12 would work as well. But yes, the answer is time. There are 40 minutes between 220 and 140. And if you treat that like a math problem, you're going to be like, well, no, that's not the answer. The answer is 80. And if you're a rigid thinker, you're going to just be like, it's 80, it's 80, it's 80, it's 80. It's like playing a picture with somebody who gets stuck. It's like, it's a wagon. Is it a wagon? It's a wagon. Is it a wagon? Dude, it wasn't right the first 13 times you asked. But you really think it's going to change? So it's a fun little brain teaser. thinking outside the box. And there's a lot of myths around gifted kids, which is why I try and give as many of these talks as I can. Gifted kids will be fine on their own. Gifted kids deserve support like everybody else. All kids are gifted. No, all kids have gifts, right? All kids have things they are good at, and we want to honor those things and celebrate those things. Giftedness is the top 2% of the population when it comes to IQ score. Like it's not all kids are gifted. All kids have things they're good at, but giftedness is a different level of that. Acceleration is socially harmful. Study after study after study after study shows that it isn't, that a lot of kids do really well in it, or whatever social challenges there are balanced out by the academic and intellectual gains. Gifted education programs are elitist. This is a tricky one because traditionally they kind of have been. A lot of gifted programs have been for rich white boys from the suburbs. We are doing our best to change that. Those things are evolving now. But there's nothing elitist about getting what you need, right? What we need it to be is fair and equitable for everybody, right? Everyone deserves to get what they need, but we want to, from a DEI perspective, right? We want to make sure that everybody has access to those programs, not just some. This kid can't be gifted, they're getting poor grades. Lots of my kids don't do well in school because it's overwhelming for them or underwhelming for them, or it's not how they like to learn. Of course, we have gifted education. We have AP honors classes. As AP honors classes, they're fine. They're better than nothing, but they're not gifted education. It's not that kind of independence, creativity that we want to see. And then last but not least, you're so lucky to have a gifted kid. I wish my kid was, and that's when we all roll our eyes because yeah, it's not. So here's some additional reading for you guys, lots of other teaching strategies. And here's how to track me down if you have any additional questions. I am here to, help out, answer questions, be an advocate as best as I possibly can. And I wanted to wrap up a little early so we had some time for questions, but please give yourselves a big round of applause. You are an awesome audience. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Matt. Will you be sharing the slide deck with
Yes.
With us? Okay, we'll make sure to get that out to folks.
And I will stop the